Good morning, everybody. In 2019, preaching my homily on the same scripture readings that we have today, I had begun by saying I want to take 2019 and just throw it somewhere. It was a hard year for me personally, but then a hard year for many of us. So for me, Dad had passed away in January 2019. In June 2019, Dayton was hit by devastating tornadoes. You remember that? In September 2019, Dayton experienced the Oregon District mass shootings. You remember that? The same month, Father Dave passed away. And I remember preaching the homily for Father Dave's funeral, and it was one of the most moving things or heart-churning things that I did. At the same time, several people dear to me, including a 3-month-old baby, were teetering between life and death. I had grown weary of 2019. In January 2020, I headed to India for my usual visit home. It seemed like 2020 was going to be better. How wrong I was. That January, when I traveled back from India, I was wearing an N95 mask. I had not heard of an N95 mask before this. A global pandemic was in full swing, and suddenly 2020 and 2021 make 2019 look like child's play. Along came 2022, and we could have recovered well from the global effects of the pandemic except for Russia's senseless invasion of Ukraine. The war has impacted energy costs, food prices, and the already precarious global supply chain. This is crazy. But a more widespread war with tactical use of nuclear weapons is a very strong possibility in our times. To make it worse, we are in election season. If you are not as weary as I am, would you please take me out for a drink? In this context, today's scripture readings seem timely and appropriate. Rarely do scripture readings give us the purpose of a parable in the way that today's gospel passage does. Luke introduces the parable in these words. Jesus told his disciples a parable about the necessity for them to pray without becoming weary. And because we have this theme proposed by the gospel, I want to talk about prayer, but prayer without becoming weary. So here are my 3 points for today. Even though today's gospel reading is about the necessity to pray without getting weary, I would like to spend a little time talking about prayer itself. Now, prayer is an all-encompassing reality. In other words, there is no monolithic definition of prayer or one way to pray. Any attempt we make to have a relationship with God, formal prayer, devotional practices, scripture reading, spiritual reading, meditation, contemplation, the liturgy, like we have the Mass today, is prayer. They're all prayer. And different people pray differently. And no matter how we approach prayer, it's precious to God. Nobody should feel that somebody else is better than them in prayer, because if you are making an attempt, no matter how feeble, it's precious to God. Now for me, the word that best describes the need for prayer is breath. Breath. You see, breath is instinctive to us. We don't consciously think about our breathing. We never say to ourselves, oh gosh, that's wonderful, I'm breathing. We don't, because it's instinctive to us. Nor do we have to remind ourselves to breathe. Breath is synonymous with life. We can say that breath is life and life is breath. And this is also true of prayer. Prayer is life. Life is prayer. Only the life we are talking about here is the life of God as well. Prayer is the breath. Prayer is the breath that makes God's life and our life one. The key, however, is that prayer becomes so instinctive to us that we do not even have to think about it, like our breath. And just like breath and life depend on each other. So if you have no life, we don't breathe. If you don't breathe, we don't live, right? Just like breath and life depend on each other, if life is not prayer and prayer is not life, we die. That's my first point. In my second point, I would like to reflect on praying without getting weary. So Moses' story in today's first reading invites us to think of life and God and prayer as seamless realities. So it's not that I have a time for prayer and then I have a time for life. No, these are seamless realities. In one sense, the scene that we have in today's first reading, you are not going to find that in any book of war manuals. You're not going to find this in any war manual, which is somebody, maybe the general of the army, standing and lifting up his hands in prayer. When his hands went down, the enemies won. When his hands went up, they won. This is not typical of modern warfare. It's almost comical. But what we need to remember is that the point the story is trying to make about Moses is that God was with the people of Israel fighting their battle and leading them to victory. And that's the point of the story. The story is a great analogy for prayer. God is in our life like breath. Life is not smooth sailing. And it is never promised that because God is in our midst, that there will be no battles, no difficulties, and no complexities. That is not the promise. Rather, Moses' story tells us that when we get weary, when our hands begin to go down, that God does not abandon us. We can find God in the very midst of our struggles, like breath. And that's the point the story is trying to make. God is integral to our lives. God and life and prayer, these are seamless realities. Finally, meanwhile, there is a gesture that is very useful as we go through life. And that gesture is hands lifted up in prayer like Moses. Like Moses, with hands lifted up in prayer, we invite God into the very midst of our lives. Day in and day out, like Moses, we invite God not only to fight our battles, but simply to be an inalienable part of our daily existence, like breath. We invite God to be our breath. With our hands lifted up, we are constantly asking God to be our breath, to be our life, not just in times of battle, but the daily events of our lives. The gospel parable of the judge and the persistent widow can be interpreted similarly. Now, this parable can be misinterpreted to mean that God is like the mean judge who made the poor widow come to him numerous times before he would rule in her favor. That the judge eventually ruled in her favor because of her persistence and not because of his care for her. But the point of the parable is exactly the opposite. Jesus says, will not then God secure the rights of his chosen ones who call out to him day and night? Will he be slow to answer them? So Jesus' point is that God is unlike the judge in today's gospel reading. In other words, like that widow, we too must approach God with confidence. We too must invite God to be as much part of our lives as the breath we take. This is prayer. This is the meaning of praying without growing weary. Folks, the last few years have been very hard. I'm sure at some point we all experience some sort of weariness. But God is in our midst. God truly is in our midst. We come here today to lift up our holy hands and pray, to invite God into our lives. And as we head back home from here, back to our daily lives at work, we realize that God is already waiting there. In our homes, in our workplaces, wherever we show up, God is already waiting there because God is ever present to us like our breath. Life is breath. Breath is life. Life is prayer. Prayer is life. May this Eucharist lead us closer to the God who is in our midst. People of God said,